Welcome to Code to Cloud, the podcast from Americaneagle Managed Cloud Services. My name is Tom McDonald, and like many with service offerings in the cloud space, we offer to review your cloud environment to help identify ways you can save money and improve cloud performance and security. And we will do so at no charge. Now, in theory, these free cloud audits should be very helpful, as a majority of companies have exceeded their cloud budgets last year, with an estimated 32% of that money being wasted. So where is all that waste coming from? Well, the list is long. First, over-provisioning. It's one of the biggest culprits. That's when organizations set up more resources than they actually need, maybe following initial recommendations and then just forgetting about them, or throwing expensive compute and storage at a problem instead of tuning things at the software level. In fact, about 70% of cloud waste comes from this kind of over-provisioning. Idle or unused assets are another common problem. Think of things like abandoned development environments that are still running, but not doing any real work. Poor oversight is also a major problem. In some cases, as much as half of all cloud resources aren't being monitored, so the costs just go unnoticed. Performance problems can pop up too. These might be caused by automated updates, software bugs, or just inefficient architectures. And when that happens, you can get unexpected outages or cost spikes. Architecture flaws are another big one. These include quick lift and shift migrations to the cloud during the pandemic, for example, that were never really optimized, disaster recovery setups that aren't really configured correctly, or scaling rules that are just out of date or just wrong. All of these can hurt reliability, frustrate customers, and ultimately impact sales. And finally, and this is a major one, security misconfigurations can create risks, whether it's through breaches or by leaving permissions unmanaged. So here's the paradox. With all these companies offering free cloud audits, why do these problems persist? Joining me to help answer this question and identify what an effective cloud audit should look like is Will McCoy, our Senior Sales Cloud Engineer, and Nathan Schlosser, our Senior Cloud Engineer. Welcome, guys. So Will, let's start with you. You're on the front lines of a lot of these audits, talking to a lot of our customers. Why, with all these audits available, are companies still overspending on the cloud?
Yeah, great question, Tom. I think there's two reasons, or more than two, but two of the big ones are when you think about a cloud provider like AWS or Azure, they benefit and monetize excess capacity. So whether that be storage that's not needed, compute that's not needed, that's money in their pocket. So they're not necessarily going to give you the native cloud insights to allow you to pull a lever and find real, actionable savings. So that's one piece. Two is that, a lot of the free audits that you see out in the market today, they, might be using a script against all the data in your cloud, which will, provide some insights. But where the real understanding of, again, actual insights comes from is understanding the application, understanding the business goals. That way, we're not pulling levers that might cause downtime. Because when you think about it as well, folks get fired for downtime. They don't get necessarily fired for overspending. So that kind of creates bad business practice where you throw resources and compute at an architectural problem to avoid, maybe going down and looking bad as a business. But a similar analogy would be, if you're going to look at fixing up your house, something easy to do is like clean your garage and throw the junk out. But something with better ROI is fixing the foundation. And the same goes for the cloud, where a lot of those real actionable savings lie at the architecture level and the application, to where it might be more resource and time intensive, but it's going to provide a longer term ROI and longer term savings. So I think the free audits get caught up in the easy stuff, in the insights you can probably delve from just the cloud native dashboards. But that's not where the long-term cost savings are. And frankly, that's where Americaneagle Managed Cloud Services can come in and help you win.
So the intent of any of these free audits ultimately is to sell you something. And we're no exception, right? We come in with, we don't call them audits, we call them assessments. And we'd like for the end result to be, when we hand you that assessment, we'd like the end result to be, hey, these guys really know what they're doing. We're here because we lack a capability. We might as well just go with them. That's what the intent is. So Nathan, why is an engineering-driven assessment so much better at identifying waste than a free cloud audit that's driven by a software scan?
I'd say infrastructure bias. The free audits typically will only scan the surface level, and they miss a lot of the waste that occurs at the application layer. We typically see about 70% waste on the application layer due to either bad code or inefficient queries running in SQL, even Redis configurations. Also, those free tools, they don't interpret the human intent behind those decisions. So you might have a free scanner that marks it everything is good, everything is healthy, but it's actually missing misconfigurations where you'll have sometimes applications running as root where they shouldn't be. You'll have different security issues where VMs are open to the public, not locked behind a firewall or an application gateway or a WAF.
So what you're saying is these software scans, if they're not engineering led, they can misinterpret intent. So for example, you have a database and it's open to the public. That could be recognized as a scan as a feature, but in fact, it's a security vulnerability, right?
Yes, exactly. Those databases should be private. They should not be allowed public. And the free audits will typically not flag those. So they'll see that as everything being okay, everything being green. Whereas we'll go in, we'll look into how everything's configured, what different applications interact with each other, and how they need to reach each other. Well, you mentioned bias. Another thing I see with a lot of the tools within these cloud environments is they'll tell you when to scale up, but they won't tell you when to scale down. It's in their best interest to have you spending more money with their provider. One of the customers that comes to mind was in the airline industry, where they had an application that was oversized, but the free audit did not catch it, and our no-cost cloud assessment did.
Yeah, so I imagine there's a lot of that bias going on, and I imagine that could only amplify when you find yourself in multiple clouds, right?
Yeah.
Right. You're going to get handcuffed by 3 different providers.
Well, you can imagine, in a multi-cloud environment, 3 different, well-respected cloud providers all telling you need more. How do you know what's true? How do you know, what decision to make? You want to keep, the business, the mission critical applications up. That is priority number 1. But you also got to keep in mind what that's going to do to your budget. So that's where a second set of eyes can often, fill the gap of knowledge there and provide better insight.
So we kicked this off by citing the fact that about 32% of cloud spend is wasted. Well, give us an example of an assessment where the result was finding a significant amount of money that could be recovered.
One that comes to mind immediately, and certainly one of our larger opportunities of cost savings, was a client of ours in the oil and gas industry. They were running an AWS, VM, virtual machine-based architecture, where they almost had each of their own customers segmented out in their own instance. And we see a lot in cloud instances that running a bunch of VMs often costs a lot. And sometimes it doesn't make sense when your whole business is based around that architecture. So we actually recommended repatriation or a move back to a private cloud on-premise data center, which cut their monthly hosting costs in half. So 50% cost savings, but you could argue 100% cloud waste because they probably should have never moved to the cloud in the first place.
Yeah, and that's an example where experience matters.
Yeah.
And understanding that's great.
Yeah, well, another example would be a customer in the heavy equipment manufacturing industry. They had a environment that was actually not in use, but the Azure free audit determined that it was actually needed. So when we went in there, we worked with the customer, determined that environment wasn't needed, and ended up saving about 30% on their cloud costs.
Yeah, so there's another example of a little bit of bias from the provider because it suits them.
Yeah.
What you've talked about is one of the key aspects of doing a proper audit is understanding the business, right? How important is that to sit down and understand the business, understand the drivers, whether it's an e-commerce site, a B2B site? That seems to be pretty critical to setting up these audits. Is that correct?
Yes. If we were to go in and audit a cloud environment without a preemptive understanding of the business goals and the history of the architecture and why things may be the way they are today, we would risk being redundant in our audit and telling the client or customer what they already know, and in doing so, not deliver real value.
Nathan, when you're in those early assessments with a customer to set up the audit, what are the things that you're listening for?
So I'm listening for their key pain points, where they're seeing issues with their environment, whether it be performance or cost-based.
Is there value to understanding how the current cloud environment is maintained, who's maintaining it, and what their backgrounds are? Is that important as well?
I would say yes, definitely. If they have a mature DevOps team, for example, we may not spend as much time there than we normally would, and spend more time on costs or security, for example. So understanding where the gap is in their bench of employees allows us to then identify the areas where there's less oversight, and that looks different for each client.
One of the biggest pain points for teams that are managing cloud environments is alert fatigue. Alarms going off for particular issues that may or may not be relevant. And eventually what happens, these teams get desensitized to them. And when something relevant happens, it's like Chicken Little, right? How does good cloud assessment and then the remediation behind it help curb those fatigues?
Another great question. But what we would do is, sort of evaluate at a high level the customer's run book. What is critical to them? What are those applications that are critical? And then from a top-down approach, evaluate the alerting that's set up, sift through, the hundreds or thousands of alerts they're getting. And then from there, start cutting back to not only reduce the amount of alerts they're getting, but to, when we get to the point where those alerts are real, swiftly remediate on them in a permanent fashion to where they're no longer going to be coming in on a weekly basis. So hopefully, in an ideal scenario, alerts go to near zero.
Nathan, when you're driving an assessment, how are you also looking at the current state of an environment and recommending changes?
We do look at the environment in general, and we determine what can be changed and what is a good improvement to make. If you have a database that's running at 100% CPU or really high CPU all the time, it's something that we need to look at, right? Because if that CPU issue continues, you're going to have application downtime, which is going to impact your business in a negative way.
What are the number one issues that consistently pop up across all these assessments? Or is it all over the board?
I think there's definitely some common themes throughout assessments. Thinking back anecdotally, some of the larger ones are underutilization. So VMs that just have too much CPU or storage behind them, they can be scaled down. And a lot of times that's because when you're creating, a compute instance, you get to pick and choose what size that is. Another one is we see storage. So there's different tiers of storage that translate into disaster recovery requirements. So if something goes down, how fast can the business recover that application or that whatever workload might be stored to the most recent version. But for some things like static content that might just be files that isn't necessarily integral to a public facing application, you don't need near real-time disaster recovery or 5-minute RTO RPO. So when businesses lack the operational decision making for best practices, it typically can get a little big to remediate, and that's where AEMCS can come in and provide that insight.
Nathan, you've been doing this a while. Talk me through the thought process of a cloud engineer with maybe not that level of the level of experience that you have? What's the thought process when making these configurations and ultimately making these mistakes?
So a typical cloud engineer will look at the application and they'll see the requirements posted by that specific application. They'll go in, provision some resources, and then realize later down the line that they provisioned them with too much CPU, too much storage, or the wrong storage. They might have provisioned it on standard storage, but they actually need it on premium storage in order to get that application to work as expected.
And to just build on that, where you see a lot more of that is a company that, a SaaS company, maybe a startup that saw very rapid growth, and they were more focused on feature development, pushing out new features to the client, time to market, all of those go-to-market activities that are important to grow the business, but not necessarily, doesn't necessarily equate to great decision-making when provisioning cloud resources, because you're just trying to get it out the door quick. You're trying to ship it, right? We see it all the time. It's not always the fault of the engineer or the decision maker. It just is necessity at the time, but nonetheless should be remediated in the long term to improve, cost savings.
I know that it's difficult enough to have a cloud engineer be an expert in one particular cloud environment. Typically, what we're seeing now is hybrid and multi-cloud environments where you've got database in one cloud, you've got analytics in one cloud, you may have AI in one cloud. That complicates things. We talk about being cloud agnostic. As part of the assessment process, we will recommend alternate environments that might lower costs or increase performance, regardless of where the customer is now. Is that correct?
Typically, I will look at the way the application is structured, the type of dependencies that it has to other external services, and the overall budget that the customer is trying to stick to. Typically in Azure with .NET applications, we will see a lot of savings running on app service plans, running on Azure Managed SQL, Azure Managed Redis. So a lot of the .NET applications tend to work almost better on Azure than you would get out of the box with AWS. When you start to do custom applications, we see a lot better performance and ease of use within AWS.
So when we're done with an assessment, we essentially turn it over to our potential customers, and they're allowed to go off and implement these changes with no essential obligation to us moving forward. But in situations where they do turn to us for ongoing service, and this is more times than not, there's a lot of value to that assessment because it allows us to jumpstart the monthly engagement with some really big benefits, right?
Yeah. It almost serves as the foundation for what an ongoing monthly service or support model would look like. So at a high level, the deliverable of the assessment is a red, amber, green report, with red being your most critical issues we recommend to remediate immediately, and so on and so forth, amber, green. And month over month, our team works to turn all the amber and reds to green. So almost a monthly managed services review where we're working with your team initially to validate that it's a priority, and then month over month, turn that report into all pretty green colors to where we're both happy.
So with all that being said, our no-cost assessment really is not much a potential customer has to lose in engaging with us.
I would say so, yes. I think in worst case scenario for a prospective client that may be interested in our assessment would be walking away more informed about their own environment, I think, which is always a value add. I think we see some business leaders be hesitant around receiving a second set of eyes because nobody wants their baby called ugly, so to speak. But I also think smart business leaders tend to not reject outside evaluation or criticism. Now, whether they accept that or not is certainly up to them, but they see the value in a second opinion as, at the end of the day, they're getting an insightful laundry list of best practice recommendations and remediations, potentially at no cost, and at the very least have a well-known, trusted partner in the space if something were to ever bubble back up.
Well, you mentioned that prospective clients come away learning more about their environment. We also learn more with each of our experiences.
Yeah, we get better all the time too when we do these things. So guys, thanks very much. Making the cloud a better environment, one assessment at a time, right?
Thank you, Tom.
This has been Code to Cloud. Thanks for joining.